The sun was a brass coin spent on a dead man's eyes. It hung heavy over the town of White Oaks, New Mexico, baking the dust until the air shimmered like a fever dream. The heat was an invisible weight, a physical hand pressing down on the brim of a Stetson. In the center of the main street, the silence was not empty. It was a coiled snake waiting for a heartbeat to strike. The only sound was the rhythmic clink-clink of silver spurs against sun-hardened earth. He noticed. Billy stood by the hitching post, his thumb hooked into a leather gun belt that smelled of neat's foot oil and old sweat. He was young, his face still holding the softness of a boy, but his eyes were the color of a winter storm over the Pecos. Across the street, the mob gathered like vultures around a fallen steer. They were focused on a small, crumbling adobe shack at the edge of the gulch. Inside was Elias, an old man with hands like knotted cedar roots and eyes that had seen too many sunsets. "The law says he dies," the sheriff barked, his voice like gravel grinding in a pan. Sheriff Miller wore a tin star that didn't shine. It was tarnished by the same greed that fueled the men behind him. They wanted Elias dead not for a crime, but for a secret buried in the dirt, a deed to the only spring that hadn't run dry in 3 counties. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed wool wafted from the crowd, thick enough to choke a horse. They watched. The townsfolk peered through cracked shutters, their faces pale as flour sacks. Billy adjusted the silk bandana around his neck, the fabric rough against a throat parched by alkali dust. He watched the sheriff draw a heavy Colt .45, the hammer clicking back with a sound like a bone breaking. Billy didn't move fast. He moved like water. One moment he was a shadow by the post, the next he was a barrier in the middle of the road. "Oh, step back, Miller," Billy said, his voice a low drawl that carried further than a scream. "This ain't your fight, kid," the sheriff spat, a dark rope of tobacco juice hitting the dust. "The old man is a relic, a ghost, and ghosts belong in the ground." "Only if you want it to be," Billy replied, his blue eyes hardening into flint. Billy reached into his vest and pulled out a small, battered tin pot. Inside, a tiny desert willow sapling struggled for life, its green leaves a defiant contrast to the brown world. He set it on a flat rock near the shack's door. The boundary was set. It wasn't a fence of iron, but a line of intent drawn in the dirt. The crowd surged forward, a wave of heat and hate, but Billy's hand hovered over the ivory grip of his revolver. The desert willow shivered as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain that would never arrive. Miller leveled his gun. Billy's expression didn't change, but his breath slowed, timing itself to the pulse of the desert. He wasn't protecting a man. He was protecting the last bit of truth in a land of lies. "I said step back," Billy repeated. The sheriff pulled the trigger. The roar of the Colt shattered the silence, but Billy was already a blur of motion. The bullet whined off a rock, and before the smoke could clear, Billy had his Winchester leveled at the sheriff's heart. She couldn't. A woman in the crowd stifled a sob, turning her head away. The tension was a cord stretched to the snapping point. Then, from the shack, Elias stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane of weathered mesquite. He looked at the kid, then at the mob. "Leave it, son," Elias whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "Not today, Elias," Billy muttered. "Today, the ghosts stay above ground." Billy fired a single shot into the air. The echoes rolled off the canyon walls like thunder. In the sudden vacuum of sound, a new noise emerged, the rhythmic thumping of many hooves from the ridgeline. The Apache had arrived, their silhouettes sharp against the bleeding sun. Billy lowered the revolver slowly, letting the barrel cool in the open air as the last tremor of the shot dissolved into the vastness of the land. For a heartbeat, the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if even the dust feared to move. Then the ground began to answer. A deep, deliberate vibration crept through the soil, rising through boots and bones alike, carrying with it the unmistakable promise of approaching riders. It was not chaos, not a stampede born of panic, but a measured advance, disciplined, intentional, and heavy with consequence. Along the crest of the distant ridge, shapes took form against the dying light of day. The sun, swollen and red, bled into the horizon, carving the figures into stark silhouettes that seemed less human and more elemental, like spirits summoned by sound and fury. Spears, rifles, and feathered profiles cut through the glow, unmoving yet alive, watching before acting. The air thickened with an ancient tension, the kind that had settled over these lands long before Billy or any other outlaw had learned to draw a gun. As the rhythm of the hooves grew louder, a primal certainty settled over the scene. There would be no turning back. The land had chosen its witnesses, and every man present could feel it in his chest. Fear spread quietly, not in screams or sudden movement, but in shallow breaths and tightening grips. Whatever power Billy thought he commanded with a single shot was now dwarfed by something older and deeper, rising from the dust itself. An arrival that did not announce conquest, but reckoning. The scent of burning greasewood drifted down from the high mesa, sharp and medicinal. Billy and Elias moved through the shadows of the box canyon, the cool night air a sudden mercy after the kiln of the day. The horses' hooves were muffled by thick sand, a soft thump shush that felt like a heartbeat. Behind them, the torches of the sheriff's posse flickered like angry orange stars in the distance. He noticed. Billy saw the way Elias clutched his side, his breath coming in ragged hitches that whistled through his teeth. The old man's skin was the texture of an old saddle, cracked and salt-stained. They were deep in the territory of the people, where the law of the territory ended and the law of the Great Spirit began. "They're tracking us by the smell of your fear, Miller," Billy whispered to the wind, though the sheriff was miles back. Suddenly, the brush erupted, not with gunfire, but with the presence of men who were part of the earth itself. 5 warriors appeared, their skin painted with the white clay of the desert, making them look like spirits carved from moonlight. Their leader, a tall man with a chest scarred by the sundance, stepped forward. He carried a Henry rifle as if it were an extension of his own arm. Why does the little wolf carry the old ghost into our house?" the chief asked, his English slow and heavy with the weight of mountains. "He's got the keys to the water, Chief," Billy said, dismounting with a grace that hid his exhaustion. "The white men want to choke the spring. If Elias dies, the water goes to the cattle kings. If he lives, the water stays for the deer and the people." They watched. The warriors didn't blink. One of them approached Elias and touched the old man's hand. It was a test of vibration, a search for the truth in the marrow. Elias didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of dried lavender, crushed it, and offered the scent to the warrior. The sharp, clean smell cut through the heavy odor of horse and leather. "The ghost has a good heart," the chief declared, "but the little wolf brings a storm behind him." The chief led them to a hidden grotto where a small fire burned low, fed by mountain mahogany. The temperature here was constant, the warmth of the earth radiating from the stone walls. Billy sat by the fire, his fingers tracing the cold steel of his spurs. He felt the eyes of the warriors on him, not as an enemy, but as a curiosity. "You fight for a man who is already dead," the chief said, sitting across from Billy. "His time is a shadow at noon, small and disappearing." "My time ain't much longer, Chief," Billy replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But while I'm here, I decide who gets to pull the trigger." The chief nodded slowly. He signaled to a young warrior who brought a bowl of parched corn and cool water. The water was sweet, tasting of deep rocks and ancient rains. Billy drank, feeling the liquid revive the parched corners of his soul. "Tomorrow, the men with the tin stars come to the mouth of the canyon," the chief warned. "We will not fight your war, but we will not hide the path." "I don't ask for your guns," Billy said, looking at the tiny willow sapling he still carried in his saddlebag. "Just a place to stand. Only if you want it to be." The chief echoed Billy's own words from the town. The night grew colder, the wind whistling through the crevices of the canyon like a flute played by a madman. Billy leaned against a rock, his Winchester across his lap. He watched Elias sleep, The old man's face finally peaceful in the firelight. The peace was shattered by a distant, high-pitched yelp. It wasn't a coyote. It was the signal of a scout. The posse had found the entrance to the canyon. The scent of wood smoke had betrayed them. The fire crackled low, struggling against the breath of the night, as the canyon tightened its grip around them. Cold slid down the stone walls and pooled in the shadows, seeping into flesh and thought alike. Billy did not sleep. He never did when the dark sounded alive. His fingers rested loosely on the rifle, not from tension but from habit, eyes tracing the slow rise and fall of the old man's chest. In moments like this, the world almost pretended to be gentle, offering a fragile illusion that tomorrow might arrive without blood. That illusion collapsed in an instant. The sound cut through the air, sharp, deliberate, unnatural. Billy's spine stiffened before his mind finished naming it. It wasn't the wild cry of an animal hunting or fleeing. It was controlled, practiced, meant to travel far without lingering. Somewhere beyond the bend of stone and scrub, men were speaking without words. The canyon, once a shelter, had become a funnel, carrying scent and sound straight into hostile hands. Billy rose slowly, feeding dirt over the fire until the glow suffocated into darkness. Every movement was precise now, stripped of hesitation. The land had given them away, and the land would demand payment. He looked once more at Elias, knowing the old man's brief peace had been borrowed time. The hunters were coming, not rushed, not careless, but confident. And in the silence that followed the dying embers, Billy understood with absolute clarity survival would no longer depend on hiding, but on who the canyon decided to swallow first. The dawn was a jagged wound of red across the throat of the sky. Cold, biting air swept down the canyon, carrying the metallic tang of gun oil and the biting scent of frost on stone. Billy stood at the narrowest point of the trail, where the red walls squeezed together like a throat. He felt the rough texture of the sandstone against his back, a solid anchor in a world about to dissolve into lead and smoke. He noticed the sheriff wasn't alone. Miller had hired regulators, men with eyes like dull nickels and hearts of cold grease. 12 of them. They rode horses that were lathered in white foam, their breath huffing in the chilly air. The sound of their approach was a cacophony of jingling bits and the heavy clop-clop of iron on rock. "Give him up, kid!" Miller's voice echoed, distorted by the canyon walls. "You're outnumbered and out of luck." Billy didn't answer with words. He adjusted his Stetson and checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds. His Winchester held 10 more. Behind him, Elias sat on a stone, holding the tin pot with the willow sapling. The old man looked remarkably calm, as if he had already crossed the river and was just waiting for his boots to catch up. "You ever seen a desert willow bloom, Elias?" Billy asked, not turning around. "Once," the old man replied. "It takes a lot of blood to make anything grow in this dirt." They watched. High above on the rims, the Apache warriors sat motionless on their ponies. They were spectators at a play they had seen 1,000 times before, white men killing each other over lines drawn on paper. The chief's arms were crossed, his face a mask of bronze. The first shot came from a ridge, a sharpshooter. The bullet kicked up a spray of red dust an inch from Billy's boot. Billy reacted instantly. He levered the Winchester, the action a smooth, oiled click-clack, and fired. The man on the ridge tumbled forward, his scream cut short by the floor of the canyon. Then the world exploded. The regulators charged, their revolvers spitting tongues of orange flame into the dim light. Billy was a dervish of leather and lead. He fired, moved, reloaded, and fired again. The smell of black powder smoke filled the canyon, sulphurous and thick, stinging his eyes and coating his tongue. He noticed. Miller was staying back, letting his hired killers do the dirty work. Billy saw a man flanking them from the left brush. He spun, drawing his Colt in a motion too fast for the eye to follow. The man fell into a patch of prickly pear, his life leaking into the thirsty sand. Billy's mind cut through the chaos with sudden clarity. Amid the shouting and movement, he caught the pattern others missed. The hesitation, the careful distance. Miller wasn't pressing forward. He lingered behind the line, clean coat untouched by dust or blood, content to let paid men absorb the danger. That small act of cowardice told Billy everything. This wasn't courage driving the attack, it was money and fear, wearing human faces and hiding behind numbers. A flicker of motion tugged at the edge of his vision, low and deliberate. To the left, where brush clung tight to the ground, a shadow peeled itself free from the scrub. The man thought he was unseen, thought patience would buy him an easy kill. Billy turned without thinking, his body answering before thought could slow it down. Steel cleared leather in a single, seamless arc, the movement so fast it seemed to tear the moment in half. The shot cracked once, sharp and final. The flanker crumpled backward into the cactus, thorns biting into flesh already going slack. Blood darkened the pale sand, soaking in greedily as if the ground itself had been waiting. The desert did not flinch. It accepted the offering without judgment, swallowing sound, color, and breath alike, while Billy stood already searching for the next threat, knowing the sand would remember nothing and forgive nothing. Elias let out a sharp cry. A stray bullet had grazed his shoulder. Billy felt a spike of white-hot rage, a Pavio Curto fire that burned through his veins. He stopped hiding. He stepped out into the middle of the trail, both guns roaring in a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. The regulators hesitated. They saw a boy, but they felt a demon. One by one they fell or retreated into the rocks. The canyon floor was littered with spent brass casings that glittered like gold in the rising sun. The firing stopped. The smoke began to drift upward, a grey shroud for the fallen. Billy stood in the center of the path, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with the aftershock of adrenaline. Only 3 men were left standing with the sheriff. It's over, Miller," Billy shouted, his voice cracking with fatigue. "Go home and tell the cattle kings they'll have to drink dust." Miller stepped forward, his face twisted in a snarl. He didn't look at Billy. He looked at Elias. "If I can't have the water, nobody can," Miller screamed, leveling his gun at the old man. Billy's Winchester was empty. His Colt was empty. He lunged forward, a desperate reach across the distance. The rifle sagged in his hands as the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. No weight left in the chamber, no promise in the trigger. Only cold metal and the echo of shots already spent. His fingers moved on instinct to the Colt, snapping it up in a single fluid motion, but the hollow click that answered him felt louder than any gunfire. In that instant, time stretched thin, and the world narrowed to breath, dust, and the realization that skill meant nothing without one last round. He surged forward anyway, boots tearing at the ground as if he could outrun fate itself. The distance between him and his enemy shrank not by calculation, but by refusal to fall, to wait, to accept the ending being written for him. Muscles burned, lungs screamed, and every step carried the raw defiance of a man who had already decided that stopping was worse than dying. The air around him seemed to recoil as he closed the gap, empty hands reaching where bullets should have been. It was no longer a fight measured in seconds or firepower, but in will alone. Whatever came next would be settled without steel or lead, carved instead by momentum, grit, and the final reckless courage of a man who chose motion over surrender. The sun reached its zenith, a white-hot eye staring down at the carnage. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, broken only by the dry hiss of the wind through the sage. Billy lay in the dirt, his shoulder burning where a bullet had found its mark, his fingers clawing at the alkali crust. He noticed. Miller was standing over Elias, the sheriff's boots caked in the blood of his own men. Elias was slumped against the canyon wall, the tin pot shattered, the little willow sapling lying in the dust like a broken wing. The sheriff's gun was pointed directly at the old man's forehead. "Only if you want it to be," Elias whispered, looking up at Miller with a strange, pitying smile. "Shut up!" Miller roared. Billy struggled to his feet, his vision swimming in waves of heat. He reached for his belt, but his holster was empty. He looked up at the rim. The Apache was still there, as silent as the stones. They would not intervene. This was the trial of the little wolf. Billy's hand closed around the mesquite cane Elias had dropped. It was heavy, weathered, and held the spirit of the old man's endurance. He didn't run. He limped forward, a slow, agonizing march. "Miller!" Billy called out. "Look at me!" The sheriff turned, his eyes bloodshot and wild. In that split second of distraction, Billy swung the mesquite cane with every ounce of his remaining strength. It connected with the sheriff's wrist with a sickening crack. The Colt flew from Miller's hand, skittering across the rocks. Miller lunged at Billy, his large hands finding the kid's throat. They tumbled into the dust, a chaotic mess of spurs and limbs. The sheriff was stronger, fueled by a desperate, dying greed, but Billy was a creature of the wild, fighting with a ferocity that ignored pain. Billy found a sharp rock and slammed it into the sheriff's temple. Miller groaned and rolled off, his eyes rolling back in his head. Billy scrambled to the sheriff's fallen gun, his hand shaking as he leveled it at the man's heart. "Do it," Miller wheezed, coughing up red froth. "Finish it." Billy looked at the gun, then at Elias, then at the Apache on the ridge. He saw the chief raise a hand in a silent salute. Billy lowered the gun. "No," Billy said, his voice a rasping whisper. "You're gonna live. You're gonna live and tell everyone that the water stays, and if you ever come back, I won't use a gun. I'll let the desert have you." Billy turned his back on the sheriff, a move of supreme confidence or supreme indifference. He knelt beside Elias. The old man was fading, his pulse a faint flutter against Billy's thumb. "We did it, kid," Elias murmured, his eyes fixed on the sky. "The willow. I'll plant it, Elias, I promise," Billy said, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on his cheek. Elias took one last breath and went still. He died in the territory of the people, far from the corrupt stars of men. Billy sat with him until the shadows grew long and the air turned cold. The Apache warriors descended from the ridges. They didn't speak. They helped Billy dig a grave in the soft earth near the spring. They watched. The warriors stood in a circle as Billy placed the willow sapling at the head of the grave. He poured the last of his canteen over the roots. The water soaked into the red earth, a dark stain of hope. "He was a good ghost," the chief said, placing a hand on Billy's shoulder. "And you, little wolf, you have a soul that the desert will remember." Billy mounted his horse, his body a map of bruises and cuts. He looked at the grave one last time. The willow wouldn't just grow, it would stand as a monument to the day a boy decided that a man's life was worth more than a deed to the earth. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered to the wind. He rode out of the canyon as the moon rose, a silver sliver of light over the mesa. Behind him, the spring continued to bubble, its song a cool, eternal promise in the heart of the dry land. The desert had its secrets, and this was one it would keep forever. He guided the horse forward, without looking back, letting the canyon release him one shadow at a time as the night claimed the sky. The moon climbed slowly, pale and watchful, laying a thin blade of silver across the mesa and the open land beyond. Each hoofbeat carried him farther from the stone walls and closer to the endless quiet, where the world stretched wide and unforgiving. The wind followed him briefly, then fell away, as if the land itself had decided it had said enough. Behind him, hidden where no careless eye would ever linger, the spring continued its quiet labor. Water surfaced and vanished again, patient and unremarkable, whispering to roots and rock in a language older than trails and gunfire. It asked for nothing, promised nothing, and yet endured. Long after tracks faded and names were forgotten, it would still be there, cool and alive, refusing to acknowledge the violence that had brushed past its edge. By the time the canyon mouth disappeared into darkness, Billy had already become part of the night, another moving shadow in a land built on secrets. The desert did not mourn, nor did it remember in ways men could understand. It simply kept what was entrusted to it. The hidden water, the buried stories, and the truth of what had passed through its silence. Some things were never meant to be found again, and the desert, faithful as ever, would make sure of that.